Salt and Aliens. The first time I met Dr. Owen Mitchell. I was pulling in lobster traps in the Gulf of Maine when a nor'easter came out of nowhere, and he refused to abandon the research vessel because the satellite tags tracking an endangered salmon migration pattern would be lost if the ship went down. And those tags represented 5 years of data that could change federal fishing regulations. I didn't know his name yet. Didn't know anything except that I was James Whitmore, 28, captain of the Persistence, a 42-foot commercial lobster boat I'd inherited from my father, and I was watching a smaller research vessel get pounded by waves that shouldn't exist in October. The nor'easter hit around 2:30 p.m. on an October Tuesday. The kind of storm that forms fast in the Atlantic and doesn't ask permission before destroying things. One moment, the Gulf was choppy but manageable. The next, the sky turned from gray to black, and the wind shifted from 15 knots to 40 in maybe 4 minutes. The National Weather Service was already issuing warnings Category 4 developing possible tropical transition. Everyone get to port immediately. I was 15 nautical miles from Portland when it hit. Pulling traps on what I call the back 40, a section of water my father had worked and his father before him. You get to know a place like that. You understand its moods. But no amount of understanding prepares you for a storm that's genuinely angry. The research vessel, some small NOAA-affiliated ship called the Fram Nordisk, was closer to open water than the coast. I could see their distress signals from a distance, flares, emergency radio chatter, a boat clearly in trouble. I should have radioed for Coast Guard and headed to port. Protocol dictated exactly that. Instead, I turned the Persistence toward them. "Request immediate assistance," the radio crackled. Male voice, clear but tense. "We're taking on water, starboard engine is down. We have critical research equipment we need to preserve. This is James Whitmore, Persistence. I'm 10 minutes out. What's your situation?" "Dr. Owen Mitchell, Fram Nordisk. We have 6 crew, research vessel, approximately 200 gallons of water per minute in the hold. We can stay afloat maybe 40 minutes if we can't stop the leak. But if we abandon ship, we lose." He broke off, and I heard him swear under his breath. "We lose everything." "Everything can be replaced," I said, pushing the Persistence hard into the building waves. "People can't." "Not this," he said quietly. "Not this can't be replaced." By the time I reached the Fram Nordisk, conditions were deteriorating fast. Waves were running 25 feet. The wind was screaming across the deck in gusts that made my boat heel hard to starboard. And visibility was dropping as the rain intensified from heavy to genuinely apocalyptic. I pulled alongside their starboard, and a figure in a safety harness was already waiting on deck tall. Lean, rain-soaked, gesturing frantically for me to get closer. As I maneuvered the Persistence in, I could see the research vessel listing slightly to port. Water pouring over the rails, crew members working on something in the hold. "I need 5 minutes." The figure Dr. Mitchell, I assumed, was shouting over the wind. "Just 5 minutes. If you can get these cases aboard, you need to evacuate now." I shouted back. "This boat is going down. In 5 minutes, my research goes with it." 5 minutes, please." I made a decision that would have made my father furious. I threw the Persistence into a tight holding pattern, using my engines to keep position against the wave surge, and gestured to Mitchell. "What do you need?" He threw me a line with 3 sealed plastic cases attached. Waterproof, heavy, the kind of thing that clearly contained everything he was about to die for. I helped haul them aboard while Mitchell coordinated evacuation of his crew, 6 people in bright orange survival suits, moving across the listing deck with the kind of organized chaos that suggests someone had actually prepared for catastrophe. The last person across was Mitchell himself, moving with surprising grace across the tossing deck despite the chaos. I grabbed his harness as he jumped the gap, pulled him aboard the Persistence, and immediately pushed away from the sinking Fram Nordisk. We made it maybe 200 yards before the research vessel rolled. Not slowly, not cinematically, just a sudden violent shift of a boat that had given up, water pulling it down and listing it sideways in one horrible moment. The crew of the Fram Nordisk was safe on my deck, drenched and shocked. But safe. Mitchell was still holding the cases, water pouring off him, staring at where his ship had been. "You saved it," I said, which seemed obvious. But he wasn't responding to obvious. You saved us, he finally said, turning to look at me. Dark eyes, sharp features, the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching 5 years of work almost disappear into the ocean. The crew, the equipment, the data. You risked your boat for people you didn't know. People and data, I corrected. Apparently that data matters. It does. He looked down at the cases. Satellite tags. Tracking Atlantic salmon migration through the Gulf of Maine. Temperature, salinity, depth data linked to the fish movements. 5 years of information about how climate change is affecting one of the most important spawning populations on the East Coast. That sounds important, it is. And it would have been lost if you hadn't, he broke off, shook his head. I can't repay this. You can buy me coffee once we get to port and don't have to actively manage a nor'easter. He smiled, exhausted and genuine. I can do that. Getting back to Portland in a nor'easter with a 42-foot boat and 7 additional people was not my favorite memory. But we made it, and by the time we were secured in the harbor and the emergency response teams had cleared out, it was nearly midnight. The coffee place that stayed open late was called Saltbox, a permanent fixture on the pier for the last 30 years. Owen showed up in borrowed clothes jeans and a Portland Fisheries t-shirt. I'd found in my emergency kit looking slightly more human than he had while saving the ocean. Thank you, he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. For everything. For not leaving us out there. For risking your boat. I'm a fisherman, I said. The ocean's my job. Taking care of people in the ocean is part of the contract. Not many people would see it that way. Not many people understand the ocean the way I do. I watched him, the way he held the coffee. The focus in his eyes even exhausted. But I do. And neither would I understand whatever you're studying. So we're even. You understand more than you think. He finally looked at me directly. You understood why I couldn't leave that ship. Why the data mattered. Why saving people and saving work aren't mutually exclusive. Because I watched my father choose his boat over personal relationships my entire childhood, I said quietly. He wasn't wrong. The boat kept us fed. It kept the community alive. Sometimes the work matters more than convenience. Owen set down his coffee. I'm Dr. Owen Mitchell, marine biologist, climate research specialist. And I'm completely exhausted and probably in shock, but I want to take you to dinner when I'm less of a disaster. James Whitmore, Lobster boat captain. Currently watching you try to maintain professionalism while clearly barely holding it together. I smiled. And I would absolutely like to have dinner with you. But first, I need to assess the persistence for damage and make sure her systems are all running solid. Tomorrow? Tomorrow, he agreed. We had dinner at a place called Neptune's Table, a restaurant that understood seafood the way it should be understood, simply, with respect, without pretension. Owen ordered the lobster. I ordered the halibut. We drank local beer and talked for 3 hours. He told me about growing up in Massachusetts, how he'd become obsessed with ocean conservation after visiting an aquarium as a kid and realizing that the ocean was dying in ways people weren't talking about. He'd gone to MIT, then PhD at Woods Hole. Then this research position tracking salmon populations through the Gulf of Maine because the data could change. Everything about how the U.S. managed Atlantic salmon recovery. The tags record temperature, salinity, depth, and fish location every hour, he explained, pulling up data on his phone. Over 5 years, we've documented how salmon are responding to ocean acidification, warming water, and changing migration patterns. If we can show that climate change is affecting salmon survival at specific water temperatures, we can pressure the federal government to expand protected zones and restrict certain fishing practices. That could hurt the lobster industry, I said carefully. Yes, it could. I know that. And I know that's complicated because you're part of that industry. He met my eyes. But the alternative is watching the Atlantic salmon go extinct and pretending we couldn't have done anything about it. I'm not going to pretend, I said. I'm going to acknowledge that it's complicated, and that you're probably right and that I might benefit from understanding the data better. He reached across the table, took my hand. I like you, James. I like that you understand complex systems. I like that you know the ocean in a way I'll never know it, despite studying it my whole life. I like you too. Even if you're trying to put my industry out of business. Trying to save the ocean, he corrected gently. The industry will adapt. Humans usually do. We left the restaurant with our hands intertwined, walking along the pier as the autumn wind picked up. The Persistence was docked nearby, and I stopped to look at her, making sure she was secure. She's beautiful, Owen said. She's everything, I replied. But not more than... I turned to him, pulled him close. Not more than you, I think. He kissed me there on the pier, wind whipping around us, the smell of salt and diesel and home. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. I'm going to be a disaster to date, he warned. I work a lot. I get obsessed with research. I care more about data than I probably should. I'm going to be gone for 3 days at a time, come home smelling like lobster and diesel fuel, and fall asleep at dinner from exhaustion, I countered. We can be disasters together. The next 4 weeks established a rhythm. Owen would spend time on the Persistence, learning how I worked, how the boat functioned, understanding the commercial fishing operation at ground level. In exchange, I'd sit in his research facility at the University of Southern Maine, watching him analyze data, learning what those satellite tags could tell him. Look, he said one afternoon, pulling up a graph on the massive dual monitor setup in his lab. This is salmon migration timing in 2019. Now look at 2024. The difference was stark. The migration line had shifted later, faster, more concentrated in colder water zones. They're responding to warming, Owen explained. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than almost any ocean on the planet. These salmon are literally reshaping their migration patterns in real time, trying to stay in optimal water temperatures. If the water continues warming at current rates, there won't be cold water zones for them to migrate to. What happens then? Extinction. Or a dramatic population collapse. We're talking about losing a species that's been integral to Atlantic ecosystems for millions of years. I understood then why he'd refused to abandon the ship. Why the data mattered. Why saving 5 years of work wasn't selfish, it was essential. By late November, Owen had spent enough nights on the Persistence to have a drawer of his own clothes aboard. My crew, who'd been skeptical at first, had warmed up to him, especially after he brought them a detailed analysis of the water temperatures and salinity patterns they could use to predict lobster migration and catch more efficiently. He's all right, my first mate, Tommy said, which was essentially Tommy saying Owen had passed every test. One evening, coming back from a 4-day fishing trip, I found Owen waiting at the dock with flowers and that specific exhausted look that meant he had news. The data is ready, he said without preamble. The 5-year study. We're publishing it in 2 weeks. And I want you there. I want you to understand what we've accomplished because you were part of making that possible. I would never miss it. The publication event was held at the University of Southern Maine, a formal academic presentation for other researchers, journalists, and conservation groups. Owen stood at a podium in a button-up shirt that made his shoulders look impossible, presenting 5 years of satellite data to a room full of people who cared deeply about ocean conservation. I sat in the third row, watching him explain migration patterns, temperature correlations, climate change impacts, watching him be brilliant in a completely different context than I'd ever seen. Watching people take notes, nod, ask him questions that he answered with precision and passion. When he finished, he looked directly at me and smiled just for a moment. Just enough that I felt it like a physical thing after the presentation. During the reception, a journalist asked him, "What made you risk your life for this data?" It's become something of a legend in marine research circles. Owen didn't hesitate. Because someone risked his boat for me. Someone understood that sometimes the work matters more than safety. And that protecting what you love, whether it's an ocean or a person or data that could change policy, is worth the risk. He was looking at me when he said it. December, the storm that almost wasn't. National Weather Service issued a warning in early December. Another nor'easter forming. Not as strong as October's storm, but significant. Category 2, maybe Category 3, depending on how the Atlantic system tracked. Fishing would be suspended for 72 hours. Port would be in protective status. Owen was in my apartment when the warning came through. You're staying here, I said immediately. No going to the research facility, no checking equipment, nothing. You're staying in a safe location while this weather passes. I wasn't planning, Owen. I pulled him close. I almost lost you once. I'm not allowing that again. You stay here. That's not negotiable. He didn't argue. Instead, he held me while the wind picked up outside, while the trees started bending, while the ocean went from gray to angry. The storm hit at midnight. Wind gusts over 50 miles per hour. Rain that sounded like bullets against the windows. The power flickered around 3 a.m., held for a moment, then died. We had generator power for essentials. Heat, water, lights. But the apartment was dark except for the kitchen, and the wind sounded like something alive and furious. Tell me something about your father, Owen said, holding me on the couch while we waited out the storm. Something real. He loved the ocean more than he loved my mother, I said quietly. She asked him to quit fishing, take a desk job, build something stable. He refused. She left, and he spent the rest of his life alone on that boat, telling himself he'd made the right choice. Did he? I don't know. He was happy on the boat, but I watched the loneliness eat him alive. I watched him choose the work over every relationship that could have mattered. I looked at Owen. I don't want to do that. I don't want to choose the boat or the ocean or the work over you. You don't have to, Owen said. I'm choosing to understand why the ocean matters to you. I'm choosing to be part of that world. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your work. Even though the lobster industry might destroy the salmon population. Even though we're probably going to fight about fishing regulations and climate policy and 1,000 other things. He kissed my forehead. Because fighting with you matters more than being right without you. The nor'easter lasted 40 hours. When it passed, the power came back, the wind calmed, and the Gulf of Maine settled back into autumn rage instead of genuine apocalypse. We walked down to the harbor together to check on the Persistence. She'd weathered it fine, secured properly, prepared, exactly where she should be. The research facility had also come through fine. Both of our worlds intact. I love you, Owen said, standing on the dock, looking out at the ocean that had tried and failed to separate us twice. I love you too, I replied. Even when you're being the most stubborn scientist alive? Especially then, he smiled. That's when I'm most myself. 3 months later, January, the federal government announced new fishing regulations based on Owen's published research. Certain zones off the coast of Maine would be restricted to protect salmon migration corridors. The lobster industry protested. Environmental groups celebrated. The reality was more complicated. Some fishermen would be affected. Some wouldn't, but everyone would adapt. My father would have hated these regulations. But my father had also never met Owen, never understood that the ocean's survival was tied to human survival. I understood. And I understood that change was necessary. Owen and I sat in my apartment. Papers spread across the dining table, his research proposals, my business plans, conversations about what it would look like to build a life together that honored both the work. I'm thinking about taking a sabbatical, Owen said. A year off. I could work on a book about climate adaptation and commercial fisheries. I could spend more time on the Persistence. I could actually live instead of just researching. Would you go crazy being away from the lab? Probably. He reached across the table, took my hand. But I've learned something in the last 4 months. The research matters. But the person I'm researching it for matters more. We'll make it work, I said. Whatever comes, even if the salmon population crashes and fishing gets completely restricted and your entire industry has to reinvent. Especially then. We'll figure it out together. Epilogue, April. 1 year later, the Persistence is heading out on an early morning fishing run. But today Owen is aboard not as a researcher but as crew. He's learning the work. He's studying how fishermen understand the ocean intuitively, how that knowledge could complement scientific research. Ready? I ask as we motor out of Portland Harbor into water that's starting to wake up with spring. Ready, he says. Standing beside me at the helm, hand on my shoulder. We work together for 8 hours, pulling traps, measuring catch, checking the health of the lobster population. It's physical work. It's real work. And Owen, despite his academic background, takes to it with the kind of focus he brings to everything. By late afternoon, we've caught the day's maximum, and I turn the Persistence back toward port. As we approach the harbor, Owen wraps his arms around me from behind, chin on my shoulder, watching the sunset turn the water gold. I've been thinking about proposing, he says quietly. You don't have to. I already know I'm spending my life with you. But I want to. I want to make it official. I want everyone to know that I chose you. That I chose this life, your life, my life, our life together. I turn around in his arms, pull him close. Ask me then. He laughs, and it's the most beautiful sound I've heard since the moment he said my name on the radio in the middle of a nor'easter. James Whitmore, captain of the Persistence, keeper of the ocean and my heart, will you marry me? Yes, I say, before he even reaches into his pocket for the ring. Yes, always yes. We kiss there at the helm, with the Gulf of Maine spreading out beneath us, with the sun setting orange and gold over the water, with the promise of a life built between two impossible worlds that somehow, impossibly fit together. When we reach port, I radio ahead. This is Persistence, coming into dock. Captain just got engaged. The radio crackles back with congratulations from every boat in the harbor. From fishermen who know me, who understand the ocean, who are suddenly invested in this impossible love story that started in a nor'easter and survived everything the Atlantic could throw at it. Owen laughs, tears on his face, holding the ring brushed titanium, simple. Perfect. I love you, he says. I love you too. Even when you're trying to save the ocean and I'm trying to fish it. Especially then, he smiles. That's when we're both most alive. We walk into Portland as the evening deepens, engaged, committed, ready for whatever storms, literal or metaphorical, come. Next stop, because sometimes the best love stories aren't about choosing one thing over another. They're about finding someone willing to understand both. Someone willing to brave the storm. Someone willing to save your life and your work. Because they understand they're not mutually exclusive. That's not a bad love story. That's exactly the one we needed.